He gave her 24 hours to leave the mansion. 5 years later, the billionaire would give anything for just 1 minute with her and their daughter. Subscribe to our channel for more stories like this. The 24-Hour Ultimatum. Julian Thorne had built his entire life on discipline, control, and the unshakable belief that emotions were nothing more than weaknesses that destroyed men of power. As the CEO of one of the country's most influential corporations, he had grown accustomed to giving orders that were followed without question, closing deals where hesitation could cost billions, and wearing a mask of icy confidence that never cracked. With his dark hair perfectly groomed and eyes so cold and blue that his subordinates often avoided his gaze, Julian was the kind of man whose presence filled a room before he even spoke. To the outside world, he was untouchable, the embodiment of success, the man who could not be swayed by anyone or anything. However, his carefully constructed image was threatened the moment Amelia Jensen, the woman who had unexpectedly slipped through his armor, confessed she was expecting his child. She hadn't come to him with accusations or demands, but with a trembling hope, believing that perhaps the love she had given him would be returned in this moment of vulnerability. Amelia's dark hair framed her delicate face, her blue eyes searching his for a sign of warmth, of reassurance, of the man she thought existed beneath the exterior he showed to the rest of the world. But Julian, instead of feeling joy or tenderness, only felt the ice of panic spreading through his body. A child didn't fit into his plans. A child meant exposure, distraction, and vulnerability. He stood across from her in the grand living room of his mansion, whose marble floors reflected the distance that was already growing between them. His voice, quiet yet cutting, filled the silence with words that would be etched into her memory forever. "You have 24 hours to leave this house," he said, each syllable precise and ruthless. There was no room for negotiation, no softness in his tone, no trace of the affection he had once shown her. It wasn't anger that fueled his cruelty, but fear, a fear he couldn't admit even to himself, and so he masked it with finality. Amelia felt the world crumble around her. She knew Julian could be cold. She had glimpsed the ruthless man beneath his charm, but she had never imagined he would cast her aside so completely in her moment of greatest need. Tears stung the corners of her eyes, but she refused to let them fall in his presence. She wanted to scream at him, to demand to know why the man she loved had vanished. But instead, she stood tall, clutching her handbag strap as if it were the only thing anchoring her to reality. Her silence was not a surrender. It was a defiance, though at that moment she was too heartbroken to recognize it as such. The house, for all its opulence, suddenly felt like a gilded cage closing in on her. Every corner, every piece of art, and every polished surface reminded her of what she was losing. Not just comfort, but the illusion that she had ever been truly loved. Without another word, she turned, the echo of her footsteps ringing through the empty halls, while Julian remained where he stood, rigid and unyielding. She left with only what she could carry, her heart shattered, her future uncertain, and a small life growing inside her that would soon become her reason to go on. When the heavy doors closed behind her, Julian exhaled for the first time since the conversation began. He told himself it was the right choice, that she had been a distraction, that sentimentality was a disease that weakened men like him. He repeated these lies until they sounded like the truth, convincing himself that in 24 hours he would never think of her again. But even as he walked up the grand staircase back to his empty study, there was a flicker of unease deep within him, a whisper he quickly stifled with arrogance. He didn't know it yet, but the choice he made that night would haunt him for years, echoing louder than any business victory. It would eclipse every success until the day he came face to face with the daughter he had denied. A mother's resilience. Amelia left the mansion that night with nothing but a suitcase and a hollow ache in her chest that felt heavier than any burden she had ever carried. The echo of Julian's words, cold, sharp, and final, followed her into the darkness like a curse. She had no plan, no safety net, and no one waiting to catch her. The city that glittered outside the windows of her old world looked very different when she walked into it alone, vulnerable and pregnant. The first nights were the hardest. She rented a small, damp apartment in a neighborhood far removed from the luxury she had known. And as she lay on a mattress that sagged beneath her weight, she realized she would have to summon a strength she had never believed herself capable of. The months that followed were a relentless test. She worked as many shifts as her body allowed, waiting tables at a crowded cafe where customers barely looked her in the face. When her belly began to show, she endured the stares and the whispered judgments, but she held her head high, for she carried within her a reason to endure. Her hands ached from scrubbing dishes, her feet were blistered from hours of standing, and sometimes she went to bed hungry so she could save a few more dollars for what was to come. Yet no amount of exhaustion could eclipse the quiet moments at night when she would place her hands on her stomach and whisper to the child growing inside her, promising love, protection, and a home, even if she had to build it from nothing. When Ella was born, Amelia felt triumph and heartbreak crash over her in equal measure. The baby's dark hair curled against her tiny head, her big blue eyes blinking with curiosity at the world she had just entered. She was beautiful, perfect, and yet every feature reminded her of Julian, the man who had cast them aside. For a fragile moment, as she held the baby and felt the warmth of her small body, Claire's heart ached with the memory of what could have been. But then Ella let out a tiny cry, a sound that was both fragile and demanding, and Amelia's sadness hardened into resolve. This child would never feel unwanted. This child would never doubt her mother's love. Raising Ella alone proved to be even more difficult than Amelia had imagined. Nights turned into days as she tried to balance caring for a baby with keeping a roof over their heads. She often came home from work so exhausted she thought she might collapse. But the moment Ella stirred in her crib, Amelia found the strength to go on. She learned to hand-sew tiny clothes when she couldn't afford new ones, to stretch meals to last the week, to turn loneliness into stories she whispered to her daughter about a brighter future. The outside world was ruthless, but inside their small apartment, Amelia created a haven of warmth where laughter and lullabies replaced the silence of abandonment. There were moments of desperation, times when the weight of it all threatened to crush her. The bills piled up, the shifts got shorter, and there were nights when she cried silently into her pillow after Ella had fallen asleep. But each time she reminded herself of the little one who depended on her, who looked at her with eyes so full of trust that it made her chest ache. That trust became Amelia's anchor, her proof that she wasn't broken, her reminder that she was building something far more valuable than wealth or status. Over the years, Ella grew into an energetic child who filled every corner of their modest home with joy. Her laughter was a melody that erased the day's fatigue, her questions endless and curious, her hugs fierce with affection. Every milestone, her first steps, her first words, her first crooked drawings of hearts, was a victory that Amelia celebrated in silence, often with tears she didn't bother to hide. And though every feature of her daughter bore the shadow of Julian's face, Amelia chose not to dwell on the man who had cast them out. Instead, she focused on the bond she shared with Ella, a bond forged in sacrifice, resilience, and unconditional love. Deep down, however, Amelia knew the past never truly went away. There were moments when Ella would tilt her head a certain way, or grin with a familiar mischief, that Amelia felt Julian's ghost hovering at the edges of their lives. She would force herself to push the thought away, to remind herself that he no longer mattered, that the world they had built together, just the two of them, was stronger than the wounds he had left behind. But fate has a cruel way of bringing back what we try the hardest to bury. And though she didn't know it yet, the world she had so carefully built was about to collide with the one she thought she had escaped forever. What do you think of Amelia's decision to leave without a word? Do you think she should have confronted him? A chance encounter. 5 years passed with a strange mix of exhaustion and quiet triumph for Amelia. What began as nights of fear and struggle slowly transformed into a life built around love and resilience. Ella had become a spirited child, with dark hair that curled softly around her cheeks and eyes so vividly blue they could cut through any sadness. She was a constant reminder of Julian, but where his gaze had been cold and sharp, Ella's eyes radiated warmth, curiosity, and an innocence that made every sacrifice worthwhile. Their small apartment was still modest, the furniture worn and the walls in need of paint, but within its confines, laughter bloomed, and the bond between mother and daughter grew into something unbreakable. Amelia had found a more stable job at a downtown hotel, starting as a front desk clerk and eventually proving herself reliable enough to handle more responsibilities. The work didn't bring wealth, but it brought stability, and that was enough. Each day she greeted guests with her polite smile, hid her weariness behind a professional calm, and returned home to a child whose hug could erase the day's fatigue. Sometimes, as she passed the tall lobby windows and saw her reflection, she barely recognized herself. She was no longer the frightened young woman who had been cast out of a mansion in disgrace. She had become someone tougher, steadier, a woman who had carried a burden alone and refused to break under its weight. Ella's personality began to shine in ways that surprised Amelia. She was witty and playful, endlessly curious about the world around her. She would pepper her mother with questions at bedtime, asking why the sky was blue, why people wore suits, why some people walked with sad faces while others smiled. Sometimes she would press her small hands against Amelia's cheeks and say, "Don't you worry, Mommy. I'll take care of you when I get big." Those words melted Amelia every time, even though she knew it should have been the other way around. Despite the joy, there were always shadows lurking at the edges of Amelia's heart. Occasionally, when Ella laughed in a way that sounded like Julian, or tilted her head with that same sharpness in her gaze, Amelia's chest would tighten with the memory of what had been taken from them. She had trained herself to push his image away, to remind herself that he had chosen to cast them out, that he was no longer part of their world. But some nights, when Ella was asleep and the apartment was silent, Amelia would wonder if he ever thought of them, if he ever regretted the cold finality of his words. She hated herself for asking the question, because the answer wouldn't change anything. Life wasn't easy, but it was theirs. Amelia had learned to stretch her income, to mend broken toys, to turn simple dinners into feasts when she pretended the mismatched plates were part of a grand party. And Ella never knew what she was missing. She didn't feel the absence of a father, because Amelia made sure her world was full of love. Neighbors often commented on the child's bright spirit and her strange eyes, asking if she had family who looked the same. Amelia would smile politely, but inside she felt the sting of a truth she would never share. Then came the night when the fragile line between past and present began to blur. Amelia was finishing her shift at the hotel, checking in a group of businessmen, when Ella came running into the lobby, holding a drawing she had made, dropped off to her by a kind neighbor who sometimes helped watch the child. Amelia's eyes softened as she knelt to receive her daughter, but the moment froze as she noticed the tall figure walking into the lobby. He was unmistakable, even after 5 years apart. Julian Thorne walked through the revolving doors, his dark hair as perfectly groomed as she remembered, his sharp blue eyes scanning the room with the confidence of a man who still owned every space he entered. He looked untouched by time, though his face held lines that hinted at unease and weariness. For a breathless moment, Amelia thought she was seeing a ghost, conjured by the exhaustion of too many long days. But it wasn't a ghost. He was real, and when his gaze fell upon her, it stopped, fixed, and hardened. She felt her body stiffen, her instincts screaming to protect Ella and run, but she was rooted to the spot by the shock of his presence. And then, as if the world itself conspired to betray her, Ella looked up at the tall stranger with the same blue eyes that mirrored his. Julian's face changed in an instant. The mask of control, the veneer of authority he wore as armor, cracked as recognition slammed into him. He saw himself in the child's face, in the color of her eyes, in the shape of her jaw. His empire, his success, his carefully constructed world, it all meant nothing in the span of one heartbeat. Amelia's chest tightened as she clutched Ella's hand tighter, but she knew it was too late. Julian Thorne had seen the child. He had seen the truth she had kept hidden for 5 years. And in that single moment, everything she had fought to protect was suddenly in danger of crumbling. The reckoning, Julian stood frozen in the lobby. His carefully maintained composure was cracking in a way that terrified him more than any hostile takeover or pending scandal. For years, he had convinced himself that he was untouchable, that the choices he made in the pursuit of control and power were final, irreversible, and justified. Yet here, in the middle of a hotel filled with strangers, a little girl with big blue eyes had laid him bare with nothing more than her existence. He looked at her as if the floor beneath him had given way, the polished marble turning to sand, pulling him back into a past he had spent half a decade trying to bury. Amelia's heart pounded as she crouched down, pulling Ella gently to her side, shielding her as if she could physically block the truth from reaching him. She kept her face carefully composed, but her pulse betrayed her calm, beating like a drum of panic. She had imagined this moment countless times in her nightmares. Julian, appearing without warning, discovering the child he had rejected before her birth, and demanding a place in a life he had no right to belong to. And now it was happening, and the weight of his stare told her that denial was no longer possible. He knew, without a word, without a question. He knew. The crowd around them seemed to melt away. The voices of guests, the rattling of luggage, the clinking of glasses from the bar, it all blended into a distant hum. Julian took a single step forward, his expression raw with disbelief, his lips parted as if words could come out, but nothing escaped his throat. His mind flashed back through the years of solitude, through the hollow victories of business deals and awards, through the lonely nights in his sprawling mansion, where silence oppressed more than any enemy. For the first time, he understood what that silence had been trying to tell him. It wasn't power he was missing. It was her. And it was this child, his daughter, whose life had unfolded without him. "No," Amelia said suddenly, her voice firm despite the storm within her. The single word stopped him mid-step. Her eyes, once soft and pleading in the days when she had loved him without reservation, were now steel, and the sight of that strength wounded him almost as much as the child's presence. He had expected anger, perhaps even hatred, but not this quiet, unyielding wall that told him he was an intruder. Ella looked between them with innocent curiosity, her small hand clutching Amelia's skirt. "Mommy," she asked in a clear, resonant voice that made Julian's breath catch. "Why is that man looking at us like he knows us?" Her question was innocent, but it cut Amelia like a blade. She had spent 5 years preparing to answer every hard question, but not this one. Not now. Not here. Julian finally found his voice, though it came out rough and uneven, nothing like the commanding tone the world associated with his name. "Amelia," he said, the syllables heavy with regret. His eyes turned to the child, then to the woman he had once cast out, and his throat tightened until the rest of his words dissolved into silence. He wanted to say her name again, to plead for an explanation, though he already knew the truth, to confess that he saw himself in the child's face so clearly it was unbearable. Amelia straightened, her hand smoothing Ella's hair, her posture radiating a protectiveness that was both instinctive and deliberate. Her response was quiet but firm, every word measured with the precision of someone who had been rehearsing this moment in her mind for years. "She's mine, Julian. Only mine." The weight of those words crushed him. They carried not only the reality of his absence, but the finality of a sentence that left no room for redemption. He felt as if the entire lobby had closed in on him, that every stranger could see through his perfectly tailored suit and recognize the emptiness beneath. He had believed himself untouchable. Yet here he was, undone by a child's innocent gaze and the defiance of a woman who had once loved him. Amelia tightened her grip on Ella's hand and turned toward the exit. Every step she took away from him cut deeper than the last, and yet he couldn't move. He couldn't follow, as if invisible chains bound him to the spot. The sound of her heels on the marble floor echoed like a hammer hitting, each click a judgment, each step a reminder of the years he had lost and could never get back. For the first time in his life, Julian Thorne, billionaire, industry titan, a man who commanded empires, stood utterly powerless, not because of a rival or a financial disaster, but because of a choice he had made 5 years ago with arrogance and fear. And as the revolving doors closed behind Amelia and Ella, leaving him alone in the opulent lobby, he felt the full force of that choice come crashing down on him in a way no defeat ever had before. The road to forgiveness that night, Julian didn't sleep. He lay in his vast Ios empty seromich, staring at the ceiling as the image of the child's face replayed over and over in his mind. He could still see her eyes, so impossibly blue and familiar, the same eyes he saw in the mirror every morning. For 5 years, he had convinced himself that his decision to drive Amelia away had been necessary, that he had preserved his empire by eliminating what he considered a liability. He had built his life on the belief that feelings were weaknesses and that everything of importance could be bought, controlled, or discarded if it threatened his plans. But standing in the hotel lobby, looking into the eyes of a child who was undeniably his, those beliefs had shattered. He had missed her first steps, her first words, her laughter, her tears, all the pieces of a life he could never get back. The realization hit him with a force that nearly broke him. He had been living as half a man, pretending to be whole. The next day he tried to immerse himself in work, but the numbers on the contracts blurred before his eyes. The voices of his executives droned on, and he found himself staring out the window, lost in thoughts he couldn't silence. For the first time in his career, his empire felt fragile, hollow, a monument to nothing. No amount of money could buy back 5 years. No deal could erase the fact that he had chosen pride over love, arrogance over responsibility. The more he thought of Amelia carrying his child alone, the more his chest tightened with a guilt that made breathing painful. He remembered her eyes the night he told her to leave, how they had pleaded for love, and how he had responded with cruelty. Now, those same eyes burned with strength and defiance, and he wondered if he had destroyed not only her trust, but also any chance of redemption. Days passed in torment. He began showing up at the hotel more frequently, inventing reasons for meetings, trying to catch a glimpse of Amelia and the child he now knew was his daughter. Each time he saw them, his resolve to make things right grew, though he had no idea how to even begin. Finally, one night, he found the courage to approach Amelia as she was leaving work. She walked quickly, her daughter's hand held tightly in hers, but Julian stepped into their path. His voice was unsteady, stripped of its usual authority. "Please, Amelia," he said, the desperation in his tone undeniable. "Let me talk to you. Let me at least see her. I know I don't deserve it, but I can't pretend anymore." Amelia's expression was unreadable, her shoulders squared, her chin held high. She didn't scream or lash out as he had half expected. Instead, she looked at him with a quiet calm that hit him harder than anger. "You offered me money when I asked for love," she said, her voice steady, but low enough that only he could hear. "You turned your back on me when I needed you most. I won't let you do that to her. She deserves a better father than the one who walked away before she was born." The words hurt more than any accusation, because they were true. He had no defense, no excuse that could erase the past. He tried again, searching for something, anything that might convince her. "I was wrong," he admitted, his throat tight. "I was afraid, and I thought I was protecting myself, but all I did was lose everything that mattered." He paused. "I don't expect you to forgive me, but don't shut me out of her life completely. Please, Amelia." Her eyes softened for a moment before hardening again. "You think regret changes what you did? Regret doesn't raise a child. Regret doesn't pay for sleepless nights or mend broken promises. You're too late, Julian." Then she turned, pulling Ella gently away, and he was left frozen, watching them disappear into the night. When he returned to his penthouse that night, the silence was unbearable. He walked through the endless rooms, filled with expensive furniture and art, but it all seemed meaningless. For the first time, he admitted to himself that he would trade every piece of it for a chance to tuck his daughter into bed, for a chance to hear her call him Dad. But he also knew that Amelia was right. Regret alone wasn't enough. If he truly wanted to be a father, if he wanted to earn even a shred of Amelia's trust, he would have to prove it not with words, but with actions. And this time, there could be no arrogance, no shortcuts, and no turning back. It was a week later when the fragile wall between Julian and the life he had thrown away began to crack. He had returned to the hotel almost every night, careful to maintain his distance, but unable to resist the pull that drew him there. Sometimes he would see Amelia, always moving quickly, her posture tense, her eyes refusing to linger on him. Other times, he would see the child, Ella, skipping beside her mother with her dark hair glinting under the lobby lights, her small hand clutching a stuffed toy. Every time he saw her, his heart tightened with a force he couldn't control, and he wondered if she felt anything in him, if blood had its own silent way of calling out to itself. The moment came unexpectedly one afternoon when Amelia was talking to a colleague at the front desk. Ella had grown restless and had wandered a few feet away, humming a tune as she played with the hem of her dress. Julian had been sitting in a corner of the lobby, pretending to review documents, though he hadn't read a single line. His eyes lifted as the child stopped in front of him. She tilted her head, studying him in that direct, unblinking way that children have, and then she smiled faintly. "You have eyes just like mine," she said simply, her voice filled with an objective wonder that went right through him. Julian's breath caught in his throat. For a moment he couldn't move, couldn't even blink, as the truth of her words wrapped around him like a chain. Slowly, almost fearfully, he set his papers aside and lowered himself to her level. He had faced boardrooms full of rivals, government officials, and hostile investors, but he had never felt so exposed. "Yes," he whispered, his voice rough. "I do." He wanted to reach out, but he kept his hand still, terrified of breaking the fragile thread that had formed between them. Amelia's voice cut through the air, sharp and urgent. "Ella!" She crossed the lobby in seconds, her hand gripping her daughter's shoulder, pulling her back with a protective force. Her eyes locked on Julian, and the warning in them was unmistakable. Yet beneath the steel there was a flicker of something else. Fear, not just for her daughter, but for herself. She had worked for years to keep this barrier intact, and in one innocent exchange, her daughter had dismantled it. From that day on, nothing was the same. Ella began asking questions, her natural curiosity refusing to be stifled. "Who was that man? Why does he look at me like he knows me? Why are his eyes like mine?" Amelia tried to deflect, tried to bury the truth under vague answers, but the questions grew bolder, and the child's persistence chipped away at her resolve. She realized that forbidding contact altogether would only fuel Ella's curiosity, so reluctantly, and with pain, she allowed Julian small, supervised meetings. The first time he was allowed to sit with them in the park, Julian felt as if he had been handed a treasure too delicate for his unworthy hands. He fumbled with the simplest tasks. Reading a children's book aloud made his voice stammer. The kids in his company had always been business associates or employees, not wide-eyed children who demanded funny voices and exaggerated expressions. Playing tag in the grass left him clumsy, his polished shoes slipping, his expensive suit jacket discarded in defeat as Ella laughed and outran him with ease. And yet, for every clumsy misstep, there was a smile, a laugh, a moment of trust that filled him with a joy so profound it made his chest ache. Amelia watched from the edges, her arms crossed, her expression guarded. She waited for him to get frustrated, to retreat into the arrogance that had defined him for so long. But he came back, day after day, often in simple clothes she had never seen him wear, stripped of the armor of wealth and power. He listened to Ella's endless stories, let her explain the elaborate rules of games she made up on the spot, and nodded solemnly as if she were giving the most important report of his career. When she scraped her knee on the sidewalk, he knelt beside her with a surprising gentleness, cleaning the dirt and whispering reassurances until her tears subsided. For Julian, these moments were revelations. He had imagined himself a master of control, yet here he was, being taught by a child how to laugh without restraint, how to fail without shame, and how to give without expecting anything in return. Every smile from Ella felt like a gift he didn't deserve. Every small gesture of trust, a fragile step towards something he thought he had lost forever. At night, when he returned to his empty penthouse, he no longer saw it as a symbol of power, but as a prison of his own making. The silence mocked him with all the years he had missed, but for the first time, there was hope burning beneath the regret. Amelia, however, couldn't allow herself to be swept away by his transformation. She reminded herself daily of the man he had been, the pain he had inflicted, and the coldness with which he had once dismissed her. Yet as she watched him sit cross-legged on the grass, letting Ella braid his hair with clumsy little fingers, she couldn't help but see the tenderness in his eyes when he kissed his daughter's forehead. She felt her defenses weakening. Against her will, she began to wonder if redemption was possible, if change was real, if the man she had loved so desperately years ago had been buried, waiting for a chance to return. By the time the sun set that night, and Ella fell asleep in his lap, her small hand curled around his thumb, as if it had always belonged there. Amelia realized with a sharp ache that the walls she had built were no longer impenetrable. She wasn't ready to forgive, but she could no longer deny what she saw. Julian was fighting for his place in their lives, and though she hated herself for it, she could feel he was beginning to win it. The weeks that followed felt like walking a tightrope for Amelia, every step a balance between protecting the life she had built and allowing the man who had once shattered it to get close. She had sworn to herself she would never let Julian Thorne back into her heart. Yet every day he returned with the same quiet persistence, showing up not with arrogance or demands, but with an unfamiliar humility that unsettled her more than his old cruelty had. He wasn't the Julian she remembered, the man who had put power over love and cast her out without a second thought. This man stumbled over bedtime stories, listened patiently when Ella rambled about her imaginary worlds, and stood in the kitchen awkwardly trying to help with dinner, even when it was clearly beyond him. He seemed determined to prove, in 100 small ways, that he was no longer the man who had once chosen pride over family. Amelia resisted at first, watching his every move with suspicion, her heart still bruised from the memory of how coldly he had rejected her. One evening, however, when Ella fell asleep in his lap after a tiring day at the park, Amelia came into the living room and found him sitting completely still, as if even shifting his weight might break the spell. His hand rested gently on his daughter's back, his eyes moist as he stared at her tiny face. There was no performance in him, no calculated gesture, just a man overwhelmed by love and regret. Amelia stood silently in the doorway, her chest tight at the sight, because it was the first time she had allowed herself to admit that maybe he really had changed. Later that night, after Ella had been carried to her bed, Amelia and Julian sat across from each other at the kitchen table, the dim light casting long shadows on the walls. For a long time, neither of them spoke, the silence heavy with all that had been left unsaid. Finally, Julian broke it. His voice was low, stripped of all authority, his hands clasped as if he needed to hold himself steady. He confessed that the night he had told her to leave was the moment he had made the greatest mistake of his life. He admitted that he had been driven by fear, terrified of vulnerability, of love, of the messiness that came with being human. He had convinced himself that money could solve everything, that power was enough, and in the process, he had destroyed the one thing that could have given meaning to the empire he had built. His words came out haltingly at first, but as he spoke, the dam of his silence broke, and years of buried regret poured out. Amelia listened without interruption, though her arms were crossed tightly in front of her, as if to protect herself from the pull of his confession. His words stirred old wounds she had tried to bury, wounds that had never truly healed. When he finished, she let the silence linger before she finally spoke, her voice firm and sharp. She told him that his absence had not only broken her heart, but had forced her to carry a weight alone that should have been shared. She described the endless nights she had held a crying baby in her arms, exhausted and terrified, with no one to lean on. She told him about the bills that had nearly crushed her, the hunger she had endured so Ella would not feel it, the desperation that had clawed at her when she thought she couldn't go on. Her words were not accusations but truths, spoken with a quiet strength that shook him more than screams. Julian offered no defense, no attempts to excuse the choices he had made. He only bowed his head, letting the pain of her words wash over him like a punishment he knew he deserved. When he finally looked up into her eyes, they were filled with emotion, and he whispered that he could never undo what he had done, could never erase the scars he had left, but that he wanted, needed, the chance to be the man that both she and their daughter deserved. He promised that he wouldn't leave again, no matter how hard it got, or how much she doubted him. He pleaded not for forgiveness, but for the chance to prove his worth, one day at a time. For a moment, Amelia wanted to dismiss him, to cling to her anger and her fear, for they had protected her for so long. But then she thought of Ella, of the way her daughter's face lit up every time Julian walked into the room, of the pure, unreserved joy in her laughter when he played with her. She couldn't ignore that her daughter had already opened her heart to him, and to deny that bond would only hurt Ella in the end. So she looked at him across the table and told him clearly that she couldn't promise forgiveness. Not now, maybe not ever. She told him that if he wanted to remain in Ella's life, he would have to earn it with every single action. That one wrong step, one single hint of the man he had been, and she would shut the door forever. Julian nodded, his jaw tight, but his eyes firm. He told her he understood, that he expected no less, and that he would spend the rest of his life proving he was worthy. For the first time since the night he had cast her out, she saw no arrogance in him, only a fragile sincerity that frightened her, because it was real. That night, as she lay awake listening to her daughter's steady breathing in the next room, Amelia realized that the battle she had been fighting for years was no longer about protecting herself. It was about deciding whether to allow the possibility of redemption, to let hope seep back into the cracks she had sealed so tightly. She wasn't ready to trust him. Not yet. But as she recalled the look in his eyes when Ella had called him Daddy for the first time earlier that week, she knew that something had changed. The man she had believed lost forever might still exist, buried under regret and pride, now fighting to re-emerge. And the terrifying part was that her heart, despite everything, still wanted to believe in him. The spring sunlight poured softly through the curtains of Amelia's apartment, filling the rooms with a warmth that felt strangely new, as if the season itself had decided to bless the fragile changes unfolding in their lives. Weeks of slow, cautious interaction had turned into a routine that none of them had expected, but all three had begun to cherish. Julian now arrived not as a figure from a distant world of power and wealth, but as a man stripped of titles, easing into the role of fatherhood with a clumsiness and sincerity that disarmed both Amelia and Ella. He would sit on the floor with coloring books scattered around him, his expensive watch forgotten as he tried to stay inside the crooked lines, laughing when Ella corrected him. He would take them to the park, pushing her on the swings until her squeals of joy filled the air. His hands would steady her with a gentleness that seemed impossible for the man who once lived for control and intimidation. Every day, in a myriad of small ways, he was proving that his desire to change was real. Amelia watched all of this with a heart that was both wary and stirred. She hadn't forgotten the night he gave her 24 hours to leave, nor the endless years of raising a child alone. That wound would always remain a part of her, and she couldn't erase it even if she wanted to. Yet she also couldn't deny the man she saw now. There was no arrogance in his eyes when he looked at Ella, only awe and fear, awe at having been given a second chance, and fear of losing it again. And sometimes, when their eyes would meet across the dinner table, or during those quiet moments when Ella had fallen asleep between them, Amelia felt the dangerous pull of the old love she had long buried, resurfacing in ways she couldn't entirely fight. The true test came one night when Ella fell ill with a sudden fever. Amelia's hands trembled as she tried to cool her daughter's forehead with a damp cloth, panic scratching at her chest as memories of lonely nights with a crying baby came rushing back with full force. But this time, she wasn't alone. Julian stayed by her side, holding Ella in his arms, with a steadiness that surprised them both, whispering reassurances while Amelia prepared medicine and paced with worry. He refused to leave for even a moment, and when Ella finally fell into a restless sleep, her small hand still clutching his shirt, Amelia looked at him and saw the truth of his transformation written in his exhaustion, in the tenderness of his gaze, in the quiet strength he offered without asking for thanks. Something inside her broke then, not from pain, but from release, as if the fortress she had built for herself was finally crumbling. Later that night, when Ella was resting peacefully, Amelia and Julian found themselves sitting together in the living room, the silence heavy but not hostile. He leaned forward, elbows on his knees, his voice rough as he spoke. He told her that every day with their daughter felt like a gift he hadn't earned, and that the fear of losing them haunted him more than any business risk. He admitted that the life he had once clung to, the empire, the wealth, the reputation, was nothing compared to the simple joy of hearing Ella's laughter, or the rare moments when Amelia allowed him a glimpse of her smile. He said he would abandon it all, every last piece of his fortune, if it meant keeping them in his life. And for once, Amelia believed him, believed. She didn't reply right away. She sat in silence, listening to the hum of the city outside, feeling the weight of years of pain pressing against the fragile beginnings of trust. But then she reached out, slowly, uncertainly, and placed her hand over his. It wasn't forgiveness. Not yet. But it was an acknowledgement that the man she saw now was no longer the man who had once cast her out. For Julian, that single touch meant more than any victory he had ever achieved, for it carried with it the promise of possibility. The next days unfolded with a new kind of peace. Ella no longer asked why her daddy looked at her strangely, because she no longer saw him as a stranger. She would climb into his lap without hesitation, pull his hand when she wanted to play, and fall asleep on his shoulder, as if she had always known he belonged there. Amelia began to notice how naturally he fit into the rhythms of their lives, how his presence no longer felt like an intrusion, but like something that had been missing all along. She didn't tell him she had forgiven him, because forgiveness was not a single moment, but a slow, fragile process. Yet in her heart, she began to believe that maybe, just maybe, their story wasn't defined by the cruelty of the past, but by the courage of what they were building now. On a quiet evening, while Ella slept peacefully in her room, Julian and Amelia stood together by the window, looking out at the city's bright lights. He slid his arm carefully around her shoulders, waiting for her to pull away. But she didn't. She leaned into him, just a little, just enough, to let him know that she was no longer carrying the burden alone. For Julian, it was the culmination of everything he had longed for, not the grand displays of wealth or triumph, but the simple, quiet acceptance of the woman he had once lost, and the daughter who had brought them back together. The man who had once given her 24 hours to leave his house now knew he would spend the rest of his life fighting to stay by her side. And as Amelia stood with him in the city's glow, her daughter, safe and loved, she allowed herself to believe in something she hadn't dared to for years, a future that wasn't broken, but whole. built not on power or pride, but on the love they had finally found the courage to reclaim. What do you think of this ending? Does Julian's redemption feel earned,